With the exception of cards selected by a search effect, you may not search or verify any of your opponent's private knowledge locations, such as hand, deck contents, or face down cards, unless you are otherwise directed to do so by a card effect. You may not ask a judge to search or verify your opponent's hand, deck, or face down cards unless there is supportable evidence that your opponent may be cheating or that there may be a valid deck-related issue. This is the new policy that Konami put out a few days ago in the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament policy, and it's a pretty big deal, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of discussions talking about this already, and I've also seen a lot of misinformation surrounding some of the cards affected by this change. In today's video, I will be talking about 5 cards that are changed because of this new verification issue, but also I'm going to talk about some cards that haven't changed that I've seen some sort of joke discussions and some semi-serious discussions about, where people seem to be confused which cards this is affecting and which cards it's not affecting. I should also mention pretty much at the start of this video that eventually, hopefully in the next couple weeks here, Konami will put a strategy site article out talking about many of the cards in today's video, so we have them all in one place in a sort of an official manner. At the moment, we don't have the article. We know that it's going to be posted eventually. We know that they're going to make it because of all the public outcry. I don't have that right now. I do have access to all the public judge groups, I suppose, and then many Konami employees and higher up judges have been answering these questions day in, day out. We pretty much know that every single card in this video works the way that I'm going to say it works. I could be wrong though, so I do want to mention just at the start of this video, if I am wrong, if you later learn out on the strategy site that I am wrong on one of these cards, I will put a pinned comment at the top, but I think if I understand the rule correctly, it's been explained to me a lot of times now that all of the cards in today's video, at least at the time of filming this video, are correct. It's also worth noting that this is called the Mind Crush change in many circles, just because Mind Crush is the example that they give right underneath that new policy. Mind Crush is not the only card affected. We'll get to it later in this video, but it is the card that people most sort of identify with this new change, and by using that example, people are able to take that and then apply it to other sort of examples and other situations, although in some cases they're misrepresenting them, applying to other cards. For example, I think a lot of people miss the part where they said, with the exception of cards selected by a search effect, which means that basically all of those cards that search things like Reinforcement of the Army or Elemental Hero Shadow Mist, anything that adds a card from the deck to the hand will still have to reveal the card just like always. That is not changed. I've seen so many posts, so many joke posts, so many serious posts from people saying, I'm just going to activate Rhoda, search my deck for any card and add it to my hand. That's not how it works. It says right there, the very first line is outlining the fact that regular search effects are not affected by this change. And while the new policy does say that you can't check your opponent's hand, deck, or face downs unless a card says so, I still see people thinking that it means that on the cards that say you can check those places that suddenly they're changed, and that's not true. So things like Nobleman of Crossout and Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, those still check the deck and extra deck respectively. That's how the card works. What this new ruling is trying to do, and I've seen a lot of different explanations that are bad, the best explanation for this ruling is that cards now do, and they only show you information as what they say on their effect. Nothing outside of that effect should be public knowledge anymore, or go from private knowledge to public knowledge. That's the big change here. People are wondering why they're doing this. It's because they want cards to do what they say and not anymore. I mentioned that part because another area where a lot of people were confused, myself included by the way, is that a lot of players sort of took this to mean that if a card doesn't say to reveal the deck, or doesn't say to reveal your extra deck, or doesn't say to reveal your hand or face downs, then you no longer have to reveal, and this caused a ton of confusion because that's simply not true. The better way that we know this is that cards are only going to reveal information that is implied on the card and nothing else. Some excellent examples where people got really confused and maybe had some misinformation posts out there are things like Ordeal of a Traveler and Moray of Greed and Personal Spoofing and even Exodia. None of these cards say to reveal what you're shuffling back or what you're, like if you're activating Exodia from your hand, in the case of Ordeal of a Traveler, you're revealing a card in your hand. It doesn't explicitly say reveal, but these are all cards that you have to meet the requirements for, and they still reveal the cards as normal. Overall, even if a card doesn't say reveal, you still have to prove that you can use that effect. So in all of those cases, you can't just lie to your opponent and say, oh yeah, I have Exodia in my hand. It doesn't say reveal, so I don't have to show you, but trust me, I have all 5 pieces. Or in the case of Ordeal of a Traveler, which is probably the top meme card after these new policy document changes, no, you can't just tell your opponent, oh yeah, you guessed wrong, and then you guessed wrong again. Now you guessed wrong a third time. You can't just keep telling your opponent that they kept guessing wrong. You have to actually show them that they guessed wrong. Anyway, I know that was a much longer intro than I'm sure many of you want to hear, but I felt all those points were extremely important to make. Let's talk about the 5 cards that were affected by this Mind Crush ruling. At least the cards that we know for now are pretty important to know going forward. First off, Royal Tribute. Yeah, your opponent no longer has to reveal which cards in their hand are monster cards, which cards in their hand are spell or trap cards. That's a pretty big change. Admittedly, Royal Tribute isn't that popular of a card. I would say that the best sort of way that you can keep track when you act at Royal Tribute, if your opponent keeps like a couple cards in their hand, next turn pay attention to how many monsters they summon without searching anything. Obviously, they're going to draw 1 card for turn, so they could still have 1 monster card in their hand, but if they don't do any more searching and they just summon 2 monsters from their hand, well, suddenly you know that your opponent may have accidentally or maybe purposely cheated when you use that Royal Tribute, and at that point you can call a judge. It's very important you do not just call a judge when you activate any of the cards that I'm going to talk about in today's video. You have to make sure that you're paying attention, and if you suspect your opponent is cheating, that's when you can raise your hand, and hopefully a judge can look into the situation and sort of discipline your opponent if they did intentionally cheat you. Overall though, yes, Royal Tribute, you can't look at your opponent's hand. They just have to hopefully discard all the monsters in their hand, and you have to take their word for it. One that gets a little bit trickier is Lullaby of Obedience, and there's a reason that it gets tricky, and it's because technically in the case of Lullaby, even if you call a very common card, even if you call a card that like you saw in game 1, your opponent technically can just say and lie and say, oh, I sided those copies out, or hey, I drew all the copies from my deck and they're in my hand now, and that's a little bit harder to pay attention to. And I think the best way, if you're still going to play Lullaby, which is possible, I mean, it's still a card that in many cases, like if your opponent has the card in their deck, they're not always going to just, I think that the important thing to mention here is that not every single one of your opponents is out to cheat you. A lot of people are just trying to play clean. There is a very, very small percentage of players that are just trying to get everyone with these sort of cheating tactics, but overall you really should just take your opponent's word for it because most players are clean players. However, in the case of Lullaby, I think the best way to avoid anyone doing any shady tactics is simply by calling cards that you are absolutely sure your opponent has in their deck. Engine cards specifically are what I'm talking about. I think it is maybe no longer safe, especially if your opponent is acting a little bit shady, to call things that your opponent might have sided out. Specifically speaking, I think calling things like Ash Blossom, when you're playing like Sail and Grace, if you're playing Lullaby, maybe you call Ash Blossom in the past, just because if they give it to you, now you have an Ash. If they special summon it, then you have a level 3 monster that you can make a rank 3 with. I think going forward, it's probably not safe to call hand traps. You're just going to want to stick to engine cards, and once again, just like in the case of Royal Tribute, pay attention. If your opponent says that they drew all copies of the card, really pay attention to which cards they're activating from their hand. It might get to a point where they only have 1 card left in their hand and they haven't used the card that you called, and then suddenly they drop it from their hand. It's like, okay, did you side out all the copies except one of them and you drew that one of, or are you lying to me? At that point, you can call a judge if you suspect anything that they cheated with. One of my favorite plays against the Invoked deck is that they activated Invocation with the intention of banishing an Alistair from their graveyard, maybe a card from your graveyard, and then you chained Artifact the Lancia, because that puts them in a really awkward position. Obviously, they can no longer banish the cards in their graveyard, but now they're forced to finish the fusion summon with cards in their hand, and sometimes, a lot of times actually, they don't have enough cards in their hand to actually fulfill that fusion summon requirement, which means that they have to reveal their hand to you, or at least with the old rules they do. Now though, if you Lancia on the Invocation, they don't have to reveal their hand to you. Overall, I think this change doesn't matter that much. I mean, it definitely sucks you don't have the knowledge there. I would generally assume, just because you would have to have, basically the card that you're looking for them to have is multiple copies of Alistair in general, unless you think that they have 2 or 3 copies of Alistair at their disposal. Just sort of take their word for the fact that when you Lancia, they can no longer fulfill the requirements of Invocation. This might not come up in other situations, but in the Invoked deck specifically, because there's only those 3 copies of Alistair, and at this point 1 will probably be in their graveyard, you can probably assume that they can't fulfill. I mean, I have Artifact Lancias, a lot of Invocations, and most of the time they can't actually finish that fusion summon. Now you don't get that hand knowledge, which definitely sucks, but it's not like the end of the world. Similarly, while Shaddoll Fusion is not nearly as popular popular as the Invoke strategy, which realistically isn't that popular anymore anyway. When you Book of Moon after your opponent uses Shaddoll Fusion, if you Book of Moon your own extra deck monster, now they have to fusion summon using cards in their hand. I would say in most cases they should still be able to resolve that fusion summon. All they have to have is basically one Shaddoll monster and then any other monster. If your opponent does that, and if they don't resolve the fusion summon, really pay attention to which cards they have in their hand. Obviously they might use something like Pot of Desires or Upstart Goblin to add more cards to their hand. That sort of complicates things a lot, but in general I would say when your opponent Shaddoll fusions and you like Book of Moon your own extra deck monster, once again I realize this doesn't happen that often, but it's just worth mentioning if it does happen. If your opponent says, oh, I can't resolve the fusion summon, definitely pay attention to their hand heavily. I think this is not the same case as Artifact Lancia. In the case of Artifact Lancia, they probably won't be able to resolve the Invocation. In the case of Shaddoll Fusion, they probably will a lot of the time. And then lastly, yes, Mind Crush has changed forever and it will probably never be played again. I think it's not so much the fear of people getting cheated. Once again, I think many players, while they do acknowledge that cheaters could take advantage of these rulings, I don't think this is Konami really going out of their way to make cheaters have an easier time. I think in general, the sort of validity of Mind Crush in a competitive sense just loses a lot of its value just because you no longer get to see your opponent's hand. That was a huge reason Mind Crush was played. I think a lot of players that maybe haven't played Mind Crush in a while are going out there and saying, this isn't that big a change, you don't really need to see your opponent's hand, but it definitely matters a lot. You knew exactly what to play around, and also something that I haven't really seen anyone bring up actually, which is super surprising. I think people must just not play Mind Crush very often, but one of the reasons that Mind Crush was so cool is when you drew multiple copies, you could use the first copy on the opponent's search, second copy on another card in their hand. That was a really deadly sort of situation. Now, if you were to play Mind Crush and you open two copies, they would kind of just be useless together. You can't combo them off. They have no internal synergy, which is definitely disappointing. Sure, you can wait for your opponent to search a second time, but some of the ways and some of the reasons that that second Mind Crush was so powerful is because you could hit cards out of your opponent's hand that they didn't search, to hit cards that they couldn't search just because you had full knowledge of their hand. So I think that Mind Crush, your opponent's probably not going to cheat you with it. I think it's very risky to do that just in general in a card game. Are you really going to tournaments to cheat people? I mean, what kind of person does that? So outside of morality reasons for not cheating your opponent because you're hopefully just not a scummy person, keep in mind that it is extremely risky just because so many people will see your hand. Any spectators, any judges walking by, and maybe even the people next to you if they're in the middle of side decking. Don't cheat, you will get caught and you will get disqualified and or banned. It's definitely just not something that we need in this game. I know that everyone knows cheaters, everyone's had an experience with a cheater. Hopefully after enough games and enough tournaments, those cheaters do get the justice that they deserve just because they really just shouldn't be around in the game. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on all these different cards that are affected or unaffected by the Mind Crush ruling. I really do think that all of these ones are going to stay true, but once again, if I'm wrong on any of them, I will put a pinned comment in the description below. But so far, all of the cards in today's video have been verified by some of the higher up Konami judges, so I think pretty much they will all stay exactly the same. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.